with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
With parades, dance parties, and festivals, Pride is back. Tonight, we hear how communities across Ontario celebrate the month in person after 2 years of virtual gatherings. Then, we'll take a look at how 2S LGBTQ+ portrayals in popular culture have evolved, particularly for young people. It's Thursday, June 23rd, and that's next on the agenda. Almost every part of Ontario this month will host Pride celebrations of one kind or another, back in person for the first time since COVID. However, it's not without its challenges. With us now for more in Sudbury, Ontario, Caitlin Cotilla, chairperson of Fierté Sudbury Pride. In Ottawa, Ontario, Toby Whitfield, executive director of Capital Pride. And here in our studio, Deb Abdallah, president of the Pride London Festival and a social worker, and Sherwin Modeste, executive director of Pride Toronto. Welcome everyone in studio and joining us virtually. All right, I want to talk to Toby first. What is it like planning for in-person Pride events after 2 years of virtual programming? I figure the word hybrid might be used a lot, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us at the moment, it's great to be able to talk to community organizations, local businesses that we work with that set up the stages or the music. Every conversation I have is one of excitement and just really joyous to be able to think about coming back in person again and celebrating and taking up spaces in our community to be loud, be proud, and come together after what's really been a challenging couple of years for so many people.
Sherwin, I want to come to you. You were named executive director of Toronto Pride in the middle of a pandemic in November of 2020. Talk to me about the challenges of not only planning for Pride virtually from the onset, but now here we are going in person.
You know, for me, it is exciting. Pride has always been something that I've had a great interest in. If anyone had told me that I would be the executive director of Pride Toronto, one of Canada's largest Pride, I would have said absolutely not. But the excitement that it brings, planning our first in-person festival after 2 years, it's rewarding, it's very uplifting to be able to be part of bringing the community together to celebrate, but to also remind folks that there's still a lot of work to do within the 2S LGBTQ community.
When we talk about, say, planning for a Zoom parade or a virtual parade to an in-person, the logistics behind that, tell me a little bit behind the curtains of the challenges and obstacles there.
Oh yeah, it's completely night and day. I mean, I had the privilege of planning one virtual, which was, you know, get the cameras rolling and things are done. Having to do with, you know, for the past 9 months, it's a constant moving, lots of moving pieces in order to get us where we are a couple days before the festival. And it's still not smooth sailing. There is, I mean, the moving pieces has been just humongous, but also I have to say, as a result of the pandemic, one of the things that we're realizing is that it comes with its challenges, but we've also seen a huge increase in cost in order to really pull together the festival.
All right, we'll talk about costs and inflation as we hit record numbers, but I do want to talk about safety and police. While many people look forward to celebrating Pride Month, that's not the case, unfortunately, for everyone in this province. Every year, vandals across this province target queer symbols in the lead up to Pride, and this year, there were several incidences in southwestern Ontario. Between May 20th to 24th, multiple Pride flags were stolen or vandalized in the city of Norwich in Oxford County. On the screen, we have a security camera image which was submitted to CBC News showing a man removing a Pride flag from the front of an Ontario resident's home. Ontario Provincial Police said Pride flags at 3 elementary schools in the Upper Grand District School Board, that's in the Guelph area, were damaged between June 10th to June 13th. This picture here was submitted to CTV News by the OPP, shows a Pride flag cut into pieces. These are just some of the examples in a series of homophobic vandalism. Deb, I want to come to you because this is sort of in your backyard and in your neighborhood. I'm curious, how is the community feeling?
I think the community is concerned about what's happening here. We're having a lot of homophobic issues at the Thames Valley District School Board at the schools. The school has reached out, the board has reached out to me to let me know what's been going on. So they had to put some new legislation in place for that. We've had some pride flags burned in London. So it's really concerning what's happening now, because we haven't had to deal with that before in the past when we were in person at the festivals before. So this is very concerning. We're kind of concerned what's going to happen.
All right, Caitlin, I want to bring you in here. Is there any concern among LGBTQ plus organizations about homophobic incidences taking place in Pride in Sudbury?
Absolutely, and we've actually had to incorporate that into our planning this year. This is the first year in which we've had to enact a safety committee and really come up with how we're going to keep everyone safe. We've seen on social media a number of threats against especially our youth-oriented events, and so we've had to take extra precautions to make sure that our community is safe. And it's terrifying to see, especially we are a entirely volunteer-led organization, and so what's happening is less and less people want to volunteer to put on these events when they know that their safety may be at harm.
All right, on that note, I want to bring in Toby. The relationship between Pride committees and police has been a challenging one, and it goes well into the past. How did you decide on the degree to which police would be involved in your festivities this year?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that this is a conversation that comes up sort of every year. Awkward. Our approach is being informed by community here in the capital region. It's a position that we took in 2017, and we haven't changed since. It was a request that was made following community consultations that folks that were interested from the police in participating in the parade do so without their uniforms, without weapons, without police vehicles, and those sorts of things. And really, at the time, it was a request also for the police to involve themselves in the community, to listen to the calls for reform and for change, and to really reflect on those things, rather than focusing on what they're wearing in the parade, to try to encourage policing institutions to have a conversation about how they could reform and be more responsive to the community. So, since 2017, our positions remained unchanged. I don't think it's necessary to really review it at this point. And what we're focused on is, the more than 200 other groups that are in the parade, making sure everyone, as an entire parade contingent, has a great time in the festival.
Sherwin, I want to get your take as well. I'm hoping to get everyone's take on this question. But Sherwin, like Toby said, this is a conversation that happens every year, and I imagine this is no different. How did you guys sort of decide how police would be involved this year?
No, and thank you. And again, like Toby, Pride Toronto membership made a decision. The decision was made in 2016. The decision stands. The only person or groups that can change that would be at a membership meeting. So again, and I think it's really important that we understand the intent of the motion and understand that there are still community members, our trans women, especially trans women of color, continues to be terrified by law enforcement. We have our young queer folks. We have our homeless folks that are continued. So again, it's more than just about marching in the parade, but as Toby said, it's the dialogue that needs to happen on how we're going to address the ongoing issues between the relationship between police and the queer community. And this is not going to change with them coming and march in the parade. This is going to change because there is some attitude and behaviors that needs to change from their end.
Deb, I'll get your take as well.
Yes.
To what degree?
So in 2011, I'm the one that brought the police into Pride London for the first time, into the parade and everything. So a lot has happened since then. The police are going to be in the parade this year, but as Toby said, they're not going to have uniforms on or weapons or anything like that. I'm on a diversity committee in London, which I brought the diversity police officer into that committee because this is a learning thing here, right? As Sherwin was saying, we want to see change, and the police are working very closely closely with me to help make that change. The community has to see that change, right? We don't have as much incidents as they do in Toronto happening, but we do still have incidents happening. And some people have just recently reported something to me, and I reported it to the police right away, and they handled it properly. So this is what we want to see. We want to see people, it doesn't matter if this is this community or any other community, we want to see people treated with respect and dignity when they're dealing with the police.
All right, Caitlin, I'll get your take. What was sort of the planning and thinking behind sort of to what degree police would be involved?
Absolutely. For us, this was actually a very easy decision. Honoring the fact that Pride started in response to police brutality and in response to the over-policing of marginalized bodies. We don't want police necessarily in uniform at Pride. We recognize that there's a lot of deep-seated trauma within our community that, is going to make it feel unsafe, even if the police in our community aren't doing things at the moment that are unsafe for queer folks. There's still that trauma there. And we want to make sure that we are honoring our community first and foremost. And so what we've said is that, if they want to come as individuals and support and be allies on an individual level, they are more than welcome to come. They can't wear their uniform. But you know what? Show up as an individual. But as an institution, as policing, we don't want that in our communities because we know that it's going to make people feel unsafe and not want to attend. And that's the last thing we want to do is isolate already, isolated communities and members of our community.
All right.
Maybe I can pick up on something on this quickly, because what I worry is that the discussion about whether or not police are marching in a parade, it actually, to me, feels like a bit of a distraction. Yeah. What 2S LGBTQ2 plus communities across the province, across the country are calling for are real changes in the way that police interact with communities. And it's not just 2S LGBTQ2 plus communities, it's the intersections of Indigenous communities, racialized communities. And this actually, for me, serves as a distraction. We spend more time talking about what someone's going to wear in the parade than talking about, are we going to spend and redirect the increasing budgets year after year from the police to frontline community services who are providing really important mental health support, homeless support for folks that are without housing, folks that are facing issues with accessing food security. Instead, we spend a disproportionate amount of time talking about what someone's going to wear to the parade. And I would just, take the opportunity to say what we need to talk about is system-wide reform and addressing the bigger picture, not how one group is going to participate in a parade of, in Ottawa, over 200 groups are participating. But we spend such a large amount of time talking about how this one group is participating when community's been clear for us since 2017. And we haven't seen the change that people are calling for here in that time.
Okay.
Good point there. I want to change gears a little bit. Sherwin, you talked a little bit about the money. Everyone is feeling it across this country. Our pockets feel a lot lighter, and I'm curious, as organizers, how have you guys grappled with inflation? Have you experienced the financial strain when organizing Pride events this year?
Yes, no, again, thank you. This year we have seen a huge increase in the cost of goods and services that Pride has never seen before. We're talking at least, in some cases, up to 40% increase in acquiring goods and services. We're very grateful that our corporate sponsors continue to be very present and continue to support, because I can tell you, the work of Pride and the activities of Pride for us and for most of the Prides in Canada, it is free. So there is no money to be made by these things, the activities that we put on. So having the corporate sponsorship, having government back and support the work that we do is very important. But coming out of COVID, we have definitely seen a huge increase in the cost of goods and services.
All right, let's go to Southwestern Ontario and London. How has that financial strain been felt?
It's been a hard time we didn't start planning for our festival until February because we weren't sure we were going to be in person. So we had to kind of try to do everything in a couple of months. And the costs have been really, really high. Security, everything. Just so you know, I just want to go touch back on the parade for a minute with the police, because in order for us to have that Pride parade in London, we have to hire 26 police officers in uniform at the closed streets to be able to have the parade. So that's a huge cost that wasn't donated to us. Yes. Yeah, so security, everything is, even the tent rentals, everything has gone up like twice the price it was before.
Is there anything that you've had to eliminate in years previous that would have normally been there because the costs have been too high?
No, I've tried not to eliminate everything. I'm trying to count my pennies and everything, you know, so to speak, to make sure that the community has, because it's been 2 years, to make sure the community has what they had before.
All right, Toby, I want to come to you talking about numbers. Are you expecting that fewer or more people will be participating in Pride this year? There's a lot. 2 years of being sort of held up in people's homes. There's a lot of things happening when we talk about discrimination towards the LGBTQ plus community. If we look south of the border, there's a lot of reasons for people to come out. But I'm curious, where do you expect those numbers to go?
I mean, I think we'll see some of our largest events and programming, and certainly the largest parade that we've ever had in the nation's capital. And I think what I'm hearing from community organizations and folks across the region are people are really excited to come together. I think we're going to see a huge outpouring of support from the local community. And I think we'll see tourism sort of maybe more local, so within a driving distance of Ottawa, maybe rather than people traveling further afield. But I think that we're going to see really big crowds at our events, at the parade, at our stages and other activities throughout the week.
Sherwin, you got the biggest parade, the biggest organization here. What are we thinking about numbers this year?
100%. We are expecting, in fact, the numbers that we're looking at, it definitely will be one of the largest Pride festivals that Toronto have seen. We're currently at over 300 contingents marching with over 35,000 individual marchers. So our pre-pandemic numbers was around 1.7 million attendees. And we're expecting that to be the same or even higher. Again, we have the privilege of being able to bring in some international artists, which has definitely attracted some international guests. So we're also expecting a huge number of individuals from overseas. You cannot get a hotel in the city of Toronto as we speak. So it speaks to not just the protest of Pride, not just the celebration of Pride, but it also speaks to the economic impact that prides across Ontario have on their local economy.
Caitlin, I want to come to you. Your organization is a lot smaller when we compare it to Ottawa or Toronto, but there's some important planning that goes into sort of the events that you put in place. I'm hoping you can walk me through sort of why it's important that you guys don't plan and overlap with, say, events in Pride Toronto.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually are in a really unique situation in that we don't host our Pride Week during June, which is considered Pride Month. We actually host our Pride Week in July. It's July 11th to the 17th, and it's been in July for the past 25 years. This is our 25th anniversary, and we have been doing it all since then. And part of that reason is simply because we recognize that people in our community want to go out into the province, go to these bigger cities, and meet people from all across the province, right? We are a smaller community, and oftentimes we think we know everybody in our own community. And so it gives us that chance to get to know these other people and get new life experiences. And so we don't want to tread on that. We want to support other communities. And often what we try to do, this year it's a little bit different because of how high the gas prices are. It's harder for us to support some of these prides. But usually we like to bring our team down. We go to Toronto Pride together. We go to North Bay Pride. We go to all these different prides and support because we think when one pride is thriving, all of us can thrive.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Great point. Toby, I want to come to you. Sherwin had talked about sort of corporate involvement, and I feel there's a sort of a running joke in the community. When Pride Month arrives, companies start to roll out the rainbows, and we call this pink washing. How sincere they are in supporting the LGBTQ plus community is one question, but corporate involvement in Pride has always been sort of contentious. And I'm curious, how are you deciding who to take sponsorships from?
I think that's a good question. I think this year there's the context Sherwin spoke to about the challenges that Pride organizations are facing with increasing costs of everything at the moment is an important context for this year. But I think more broadly, our approach is really to partner with organizations that are doing important good work year-round. We do know that some folks will roll out a marketing campaign for the month of June. I think that's important. I think it serves an important purpose. But we're really looking forward to partnering with groups that are trying to maybe engage in their local community outside of June, or engage their employees with an employee resource group, or perhaps bring guest speakers in throughout the year. And certainly I've noticed in the last few years of working with different companies and organizations here that there is an interest in doing this kind of work 365 days a year. I think maybe in response to calls from community to go beyond just a partnership during Pride, companies are saying, how do we engage the communities we work with? How do we engage our employees year round? So it is building more inclusive workplaces and more inclusive communities. And so what we do is when someone contacts us and they want to be involved in Capital Pride, we do have a statement and a commitment of principles and equity that we ask folks to sign on to. And we have those conversations. What are you doing beyond just being in the parade to engage your employees, engage your business, your customers, and all of those types of opportunities?
All right, I want to get the takes of the two smaller sort of urban centers. I see, Caitlin, you're agreeing there. Walk me through sort of that process in terms of how you're taking sponsorships.
Yeah, absolutely. So being located in Northern Ontario, we have a lot less access to resources in compared to some of these other larger urban areas. And so we really struggle to finance our Pride. And, we are an entirely volunteer-led organization because we can't afford to pay a staff member. And so we have to constantly be asking for money, and we don't have grant funding available to us necessarily that is dedicated to some of these, larger expenses. And so we have to really rely on these corporate sponsorships to get us through the year. And what we've had to do is sit down and say, what is the line in the sand we absolutely will not cross, and kind of go from there. So a great example is, we don't want to take money from a bank that is investing in oil, or a corporation that's actively investing in campaigns that are anti-LGBTQ plus, right? That's our line in the sand, and we won't take money from police. And we won't cross those lines, but otherwise it has to be a case-by-case basis, because if every year we're fighting for that funding, we want to make sure we can put on this event. And so it's been hard, and sometimes we've had to make some morally gray choices to make sure that we're still able to offer this to our community.
Deb, I want to get your take on that.
Yes, so in London, we're a volunteer board also. We can't afford an EA, or ED, I should say. So we have to send out sponsorships letters to the community all the time, asking for help to put on this Pride. And we're still doing that, actually, and we're like a month out from our festival. So one concern we have, and I know we're working with at least one of our corporate sponsors that really we're really questionable whether they're in this for the right reason, because they think that we should have money to support this festival without relying on corporate sponsors. And that's not the way this is. This is a nonprofit organization, and we can't put this festival on without getting sponsorships and donations from corporations and businesses in the community. So that's a big issue for us. And that's rainbow washing right there.
There you go. Sharon, I'll get your take on there as well.
No, so again, I want to say for the record that Pride Toronto, annually, we turn down thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars from large corporations who do not fit within the mandate of Pride Toronto. So we actually have a sponsorship deck that goes out, and there's an application process to become a sponsor in Pride. And if you do not demonstrate that you are committed, not just for Pride Month, but for year-round, because you can't come and give us money but you're not offering same-sex benefits, and those pieces. So for us, those things are really, really important. And again, we might differ in Toronto from a Pride up north, but ultimately, I think the vision of making sure that we're accepting what we will call clean money is very important.
All right, I want to bring up a point. We talked about corporate sponsors, which is obviously a big chunk of money, but grants also play a big one. And there's a bit of a storyline here with Pride Toronto. You were not we should clarify, you were not the executive director at the time. So, but these allegations, independent audit by accounting firm KPMG found that Pride Toronto failed to meet the conditions of 3 federal government grants totaling almost $2 million. There were other allegations that Pride Toronto also falsified documents, exploited Indigenous and Two-Spirit artists in the past. I'm curious, now that you are at the helm, how are you and your team working to rebuild and improve Pride Toronto, not just its image, but more importantly, the relationships there?
No, and again, from the get-go, when I walked in to Pride Toronto, realized, okay, and this is on the record, that there were some things that were just not adding up. And this is why we went to KPMG and said, you know, can you come in? Can you help us to understand where we went wrong? And Pride Toronto has accepted all of the recommendations that KPMG presented. And I'm happy to say that of all the recommendations, almost 90% of them were already in place even before the recommendations. So we identified where the gaps were prior. We have a new board of directors, you have a new ED that was really focused on governance. And in relation to relationship building, it is an ongoing piece that we have to do, building relationship not just with the Indigenous community, but also with the general community who have been left out, you know, BIPOC folks who felt they have been left out of Pride Toronto. So a lot of the policies and procedures that we're putting in place will ensure falsifying of documents, you know, that grants that was meant for A is no longer going to be. And if folks check our website, they will now be able to see these are the grants we applied for, these are the ones we received, and here are the reports to prove that we have done the work that we said we were going to be doing.
All right. Caitlin, I want to come to you. Obviously, Northern Ontario. When we talk about Indigenous engagement, what does that look like this year for Sudbury Pride?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, we've run into a lot of challenges when it comes to engaging many of the marginalized communities here in Sudbury, because COVID burnout is a real thing. And it's something that, because we don't have access to the same resources as some of these larger Pride organizations, paying people is not the same level of pay that you would get in some of these larger cities. And so we've had to be very creative and work with a lot of these organizations that are already doing this work. One thing we noticed when we started planning this year is that a lot of these organizations that are doing work in Sudbury, we've all been working in silos. So we've all been doing our own things and stepping on each other's toes. And this year, we really wanted to revamp the way that we went forward as an organization. You know, it's our 25th anniversary, and our idea was we're going to look back and honor the past 25 years, but create a better future for the next 25 years. And so part of that was making sure that we're building those relationships and working alongside these communities and these organizations doing that work already. So rather than imposing or trying to step on people's toes, we're all working together as a community. Because at the end of the day, that's the goal, is for us to come together and work together as a community and do something for our community.
Toby, Caitlin had mentioned earlier sort of the revolutionary roots of Pride and how it came to be. And some critics have accused Pride of straying away from that. From an organizer's perspective, are you hoping to mobilize the queer community to demonstrate against discrimination, or is this to bring everyone for a much overdue party? I know it's probably both, but is there a balance there that you're trying to strike?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is both, right? I think reflecting here, we try and celebrate both. I think the parade is a huge celebratory opportunity, but it's also an opportunity for many local organizations to create a platform, to have a platform to bring forward messages that are important to them or that they're working on as a community. But I'll just say, you know, we just wrapped up a provincial election here in Ontario, and many Pride organizations and other frontline to us LGBTQ2 plus groups came together to have a provincial-wide advocacy campaign around securing more funding for frontline services, for securing better gender-affirming healthcare options for community. So I think it will always be both. I don't think for us we choose one or the other. I think we think about our advocacy work when we're choosing speakers and performers, and when we're working with different community groups here to make sure that there is that balance. And I think, you know, we're lucky to have so many great other organizations in the city and in the region that are also involved in a variety of different advocacy campaigns. And we try to use our platforms to also amplify their messages too.
Deborah, I'm hoping to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I took over in November of last year, one of the issues is there was a divide amongst our community with Pride London, especially the trans community, because they weren't treated very well by the board or the president that was back in 2019. So I'm working really hard to mend those fences and bring this community back together, because I think it's really important. So record keeping is a really big thing. I know Sherwin walked into something, and so I've walked into something too, obviously, because I didn't get records from a couple of years ago, and that's really concerning. So I'm putting all new policies in place with Pride London and making sure that there's a paper trail for everything, right?
All right, we have about less than a minute left. Sherwin, you got the last question. What are your hopes for the future of Pride, not only here in Toronto, but in Ontario?
My hopes for Prides, and again, I will take it even one step further across the world, is to see my queer siblings, no matter where, whether they're in Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, Australia, to be able to be their authentic self and celebrate, so that we can get rid of the protests and we can be a celebration to our community.
Deb, Sherwin, Caitlin, Toby, I want to thank you so much. I know it's going to be a very, very busy days and weeks as we go into July as well. I know I will be having a drink at behind the 519, so it will be a splendid time. But thank you so much for your insights and your perspectives.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and
Thank
happy
you.
Pride.
Thank you. Happy Pride.
Once upon a time, there were no out queer characters in children's books, programs, movies, or magazines. Times have changed. Joining us now to find out how kids' media portray 2S LGBTQ+ folks, we're joined by, on the shores of the Detroit River in Amherstburg, Ontario, Cara Brisson-Boivin, Director of Research for Media Smarts. And in Waterloo, Ontario, J. Andrew DeMann, professor in the English department at the University of Waterloo and St. Jerome's University, whose research explores representation in comics. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Cara, I'm going to start with you. I'm hoping you can sort of set the landscape here and maybe give us an evaluation. How are we doing when it comes to queer representation in youth-oriented media here in Canada?
Well, I think we've come a long way and we have things to be proud of, but we still have a ways to go. You know, we have, in many ways, Canada is seen as a global leader in its representation of LGBTQ+ communities. We have the examples of Schitt's Creek, where the main character is pansexual and he describes his sexuality as liking the wine and not the label. We have the Canadian series Sort of, where the main character there is non-binary. And that show's really setting the bar in terms of intersectional representation. You know, that character is a queer South Asian Muslim. You know, we have legislation that protects, representation in the media industry. But the Canadian Radio Television Commission has lately undergone a review of its diversity and representation in CanCon and has found that fewer than half of Canadians feel that they are accurately or meaningfully represented in the Canadian media landscape. So we are definitely still dealing with challenges of underrepresentation. We are definitely still dealing with issues of stereotyping, where LGBTQ+ characters are relegated to niche roles or really represented in narrow ways. And we're also dealing with the challenge of othering, where particular aspects of a character, like their sexuality, are overemphasized in a way that sort of doubles down on difference.
Andrew, I want to get your take in there. I see a lot of head nodding, so a lot of agreements there. But I imagine, if you can give us sort of a grade or how we're doing when it comes to queer representation, what would you say?
I agree with a lot of what was said. I think there's certain sectors where you're seeing more growth than others. I think the Canadian graphic novel market, the North American graphic novel market are really good examples of that, where there is a little bit more emphasis on representing queer characters and telling queer stories. So I think it's not universal. It's not an entirely level playing field. It sort of fits and surges here and there.
All right, Andrew, I want to follow up with you. Historically and more recently, how much does fiction actually impact reality? And when I talk about the social impact.
Yeah, this is the million-dollar question in the arts. I think most people like to believe that the arrow points both ways. That the worlds that we portray in our media affect our reality, and our worlds that we portray in our media should also impact our reality in a meaningful way. I think when it comes to queer representation, you've got a little bit of an imbalance where the world that we're seeing in our media doesn't reflect the reality that we live. And that can compound the problem where you have a lot of people who are feeling underrepresented. And even beyond that, you're encountering people who feel like they don't know how to interact with people who are queer because they don't see them portrayed in the media at all. So it's sort of impacting everybody in a way. I think ideally, the goal from any arts perspective would be to have a world that is very similar and proportional in fiction to reality. And we're not seeing that yet.
Kara, it sounds like an obvious question here, but what are the benefits? And Andrew had sort of highlighted some of those when we talk about expanding queer representation in youth-oriented media.
Well, I think one of the beautiful, sort of powerful pieces of all forms of media is that it provides audiences, but especially young audiences, with either a window opportunity or a mirror opportunity. A mirror opportunity is when you're seeing yourself represented on the screen or in the form of media. And a window opportunity is when you're being exposed to another kind of identity or experience that you might not normally in your everyday life. And so, representation is incredibly powerful. For marginalized groups, seeing themselves accurately represented is incredibly powerful, has been linked to, increased academic achievement, self-esteem, and similarly, seeing accurate representations of groups like the queer community has been linked to, a reduction in prejudice. So again, the power of representation really can't be understated.
Andrew, you talked about sort of a little bit of the socialization aspect as well, that these portrayals can have a socializing influence on children's development. What does that mean?
We tend to frame it, as in modern media scholars, in terms of the construction of the self, which is understanding who you are and valuing yourself within the world. And that can be, a very kind of personal thing about, self-identification, but it can also be a health thing. We know, for example, that queer youth and trans youth are extremely susceptible to a lot of very real physical maladies compared to the general population. We're talking about increased rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. So there are very real quantitative outcomes that are coming out of this. So if you have representation that can intervene, as many scholars have suggested it can, in your construction of the self and reduce some of that anxiety, reduce some of that depression, you can literally impact the health and well-being of youth on a massive scale without sending them to the doctor.
Do you have any examples of media showing those interventions that come to mind?
That come to mind, so scholarly example, Catherine Bond Stockton, who is the author of The Queer Child, which is still considered maybe the most landmark text on how media portrayals of queer children impact that concept of the self. She talks a lot about how the silences surrounding queerness can only be broken in fictional media. Because we need that fantasy construction first, and that then creates pathways for things like acceptance, things like identification. In terms of the actual, like people talking about the results, one of the great examples, and again, my expertise is in comics, you have all these creators, really famous Eisner Award-winning creators, talking about why they put queer characters into their books. And they keep saying this weirdly consistent thing that I wrote this book because this is the book I needed when I was a teenager. That this book was, designed to save my life, essentially. And I think the reiteration of that statement is powerful in itself from people who've been through that and lived that experience. And we also have other examples of journalists. May Root has talked about this, how the book Lumberjanes was, again, the book she needed when she was a teenager, when she lived through thoughts of suicidal ideation every single day. Just for being who she was and seeing how she was not integrated into her society. So seeing fictional worlds where characters are integrated into society, and the example of Schitt's Creek is a great one too. I think that can be really important to someone's general well-being, again, not just mentally, but medically as well.
Kara, we want to talk about authentic representation. That is something that I think a lot of people have talked about in the past when we talk about characters as well, when we in media. I'm hoping you can give us a little peek behind the curtain when we talk about behind the media industry, the media sector, that might be contributing to the lack of authentic representation.
Yeah, I think, underrepresentation behind the scenes generally typically translates into underrepresentation or misrepresentation on the screen. Since the 1960s, feminists have been saying it matters who makes media, and who makes media today is still typically straight white men. And so, we're not necessarily going to see better representation, or perhaps it is not surprising why we're struggling with some of the problems we are struggling with, until the people behind the scenes in, director and producer and making corporate decisions are also represented of a variety of different communities, including and most importantly marginalized communities.
All right, I want to bring up an example, a recent example. Disney's Buzz Lightyear movie was banned or restricted in 14 countries where it was showing a scene same-sex characters kissing, and it may be seen as immoral in those countries. Do we see some of those sentiments here in Ontario? I'll start with Kara.
Yeah, I think regardless of whether we're seeing the specific examples in Ontario, because of the networked world that we're living in, we all have access to these sort of global stories at our fingertips. And our children are listening and are cognizant of the things that adults discuss as being controversial. So it is incredibly important to have conversations with our children at a young age, as young as possible, about things like stereotypes and representation. Media Smarts has lots of helpful tip sheets and tools for parents and guardians and educators to talk to young children about stereotypes and representation. We also have a whole sort of suite of resources that help parents seek out positive portrayals, some of the ones that Andrew was mentioning for their children. In fact, we have a partnership with TVO Kids where we've done these wacky media songs. One of them is called You Do You, and it's all about pushing back against stereotypes for children.
All right, I want to follow up with that, Andrew. What are some of the reasons why portraying LGBTQ plus characters in youth-oriented media, but also I find sometimes in adult media, to be so contentious? I have sat in rooms with people who have said that they have seen stuff on screen and they've questioned, why does there need to be so much representation? As someone who's in the queer community, I sort of scratch my head, I bite my tongue. But, why is it so contentious when we talk about youth-oriented media?
I think we're in a cultural landscape where we have a lot of competing belief structures, different ideologies, different politics, obviously different religion, different educational standards. As a result of that, you've got sort of queer children caught in this horrible tug of war. And they're being pushed in every different direction. And I think that just adds to the sense of confusion. I think we need to be respectful of everybody's beliefs. But the best way that we can kind of work through those issues is through open dialogue, not through erasure, symbolic annihilation, which historically has never gone well. I'm assuming Kara would agree with me on that, just in terms of the broader media sentiment.
Kara, I think it's important when we talk about sort of LGBTQ youth-oriented media, we can't ignore what's happening south of the border, where there is that bill that's been dubbed, that is now law, that says "Don't Say Gay," which is really preventing the conversation around sexual orientation and identity between kids from kindergarten to up to grade 3. And I just want to pick up on the point: why is it so contentious?
Well, I would echo some of what has already been said, but emphasize that I think it's important for us to pause here and reflect on the fact that these portrayals are contentious perhaps to a few adults, but not necessarily to young people. And young children, even especially under the age of 9, don't typically question whether what they're seeing on the screen is reflective of reality unless they're prompted by an adult. So really making it incredibly important to have these conversations with younger youth. But as youth age up, they move into their older tweens and teens, they become far more aware of representation issues and will actively seek out better representative material. And so again, I think they're only contentious insofar as it's, in some cases, adults projecting what we believe to be contentious onto young people. And also that they're contentious because they are challenging structural inequities. They are challenging portrayals of what we believed to be, or have, come to accept as the norm, in this case, heterosexuality. So, and young people are often at the forefront and sometimes much further ahead than adults in terms of being willing and open to embrace, difference.
We don't give kids much credit, I don't think. But yes, I want to talk about stereotypes, and I want to pull up some data that was done through a focus group. The Black Screen Office conducted focus groups and one-on-one interviews about representation in media with over 400 Canadians for the Being Seen report, which was published in February 2022. In the 2S LGBTQI plus communities report, the researchers identified several problematic reoccurring stereotypes associated with queer characters in media. They include the gay best friend, the villain, gay white males as the sole example of queer representation, 2S LGBTQIA plus people only being seen through the lens of trauma, inaccurate portrayals such as queer characters being promiscuous, and lack of intersectionality. I'll bring Andrew in here. What are some of the challenges that remain when it comes to portraying queer characters, particularly in media geared towards younger audiences?
Yeah, I think there are some specific challenges that come out of the broader institutions of society and how we literally raise children. I mean, we've heard the expression, it takes a village to raise a child. Kat Lay, who's the author of Snapdragon, points out that a lot of queer children are not raised in queer families. As a result of that, they don't really get the kind of role modeling that they need. And there's a spectrum there up to and including being absolutely rejected by their parents for being queer. So the idea that comes up a lot in queer communities is the concept of found family, of making your own family structure and learning how to do role modeling and all that kind of internally, and maybe taking on some of the aspects that we usually associate with the institution of parenthood. So that's a very interesting kind of variation, because you've got one institution failing and the other picking up the slack. And I think media can play a role in that. And a lot of queer youth talk about that as well. Seeing themselves in media and understanding themselves in media in a way that even their family can't really talk to them about or help them out with. So I think there are certain particulars, let's say, with regard to growing up queer that make it very important for us to have, I don't want to call it like a media safety net in place in order to pick up some of the slack when the traditional institutions, just maybe even not even for lack of trying, really don't have the ability to provide the supports that the children need.
Kara, I'm hoping you can pick up on that when we talk about challenges that remain when it comes to portraying queer characters.
Yeah, and I think I would echo that, but also reflecting on what you pulled up on the screen and what we were seeing there in terms of those stereotypes. Again, that is in part because the industry remains very risk averse when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and is typically creating content, especially when it's original content, for white, cisgendered, straight audiences. And so we have to keep that in mind. I think the other thing when it comes to challenges that remain, we've been talking about it, is that queerness is not yet represented in the media landscape as a fact of life, as just sort of existing because it exists. And so that's also a big challenge, echoing some of what Andrew said around allowing youth to see themselves meaningfully and accurately represented and reflected, but also that, youth need to see a variety of identities and experiences and stories so that, yes, marginalized communities and issues and challenges are reflected, but also so that they can simply be, because they exist and they are a fact. That is a fact of life. And we certainly haven't reached that point yet.
All right, I want to bring up a point that Andrew had made earlier in the program when we talk about access and interacting with healthcare. Could expanding queer representation lead to changes in how younger people interact with healthcare and social services? You touched on it a little bit, but I'm hoping we can expand on that.
Yeah, I think so. So my research came from a development at my university, St. Jerome's, where we're launching, pending final approval next fall, a health humanities program, which is all about the interactions and intersections of health and humanities, which of course includes media. So understanding how, I don't know, things like, say, trans people might be reluctant to seek out healthcare for fear of being stigmatized. Again, that's a place where media can intervene. And again, spread the word that trans people exist and are viable as human beings in the most basic sense, right? That can be important. Again, lowering depression rates, anxiety rates, suicide rates. Those are major health interventions. We live in a country that has socialized healthcare. You're talking about saving the taxpayer a whole lot of money in that process. If our media can play a part in our overall approach to human health, that's amazing. That's a breakthrough.
I want to pick up on the point you said, spread the word, and a question for both of you. I'll start with Kara. What can audiences do in their role as consumers to advance queer representation?
Well, I think one thing that's really interesting to focus on, and we haven't really talked about it too much, is the role of the digital sort of world. And, we're talking about the networked media environment we're living in. So things like streaming services, video sharing services, and those kinds of services, that are providing content to us that is algorithmically driven. They are very much, delivered and centered on things like watch time and engagement. And in that regard, audiences have quite a powerful role to play. Digital content that is largely driven by either watch time or engagement, is going to be to a good degree impacted by how much time we watch or engage with things. But I say this because I think it really emphasizes the importance of digital media literacy, because first and foremost, audiences need to be aware of those kinds of factors that I was speaking to that will influence how we're given and our content is delivered to us, but also the power they have in influencing that. So, unless we are aware that, the amount of time we're watching content, or whether we like something in a social platform or on YouTube, will impact how often audiences are seeing it. Audiences are less likely to actually engage in that power or utilize that power. And I think the last thing I would say as far as digital media literacy in youth is really emphasizing for young people, not just that their voice matters and that they have a place to play in the landscape, and that their stories and experiences ought to be heard, but emphasizing for young people that all media has social and political implications. And even when it appears not to, that is typically because it is reinforcing how we already see the world.
Andrew, we'll pick up on that in terms of what audiences can do as their role as consumers.
Yeah, I really like what Kara is saying. I think it's all about having conversations with your children. It's about participating in their media, which can be painful as a parent sometimes, but it's good to watch what they're watching and have conversations with them about it. And then specifically to the subject of queer youth, the digital world can actually be very empowering in terms of creating a level of safety and security by which they can seek out media portrayals. Whereas, in the old days, maybe you don't want to go to the video store and rent something that would be looked at as specifically queer for fear of being, identified within your society. Online spaces can offer, in as much as people view online spaces as being kind of predatory and dangerous, and those dangers are real, it can also be very empowering for queer youth, allowing them to find representation that they might otherwise be unable to access.
I do want, we have a couple of minutes left in the program, and I do want to possibly scroll back a little bit. And it is a question for our audience, for people who are tuning in who may not know what 2S LGBTQIA stands for. I was wondering, Kara, can you hop in there and sort of give us a breakdown a little bit on sort of what that acronym actually means?
Sure. So 2S is referring to two-spirited, and LGBT, that lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, non-binary community, and plus, because there are all sort of identities along what some people call a spectrum. But I think, and there's also a contention within the community about queerness, because for a long time that term was seen as being quite derogatory, but typically younger members of that community have sort of re-embraced that term and are using it in a sort of activist or way to re-story what it means to be queer. But yeah, I think, at the end of the day, like, that community is a diverse community. We need to keep in mind that there are, like any other community, challenges and differences. And I think one of the beauties of the acronym is that it is an attempt to capture the difference within the community.
All right, I don't want to put you on the spot for both of you, but I'm curious, for members of that community, their allies, and consumers of youth-oriented media, Andrew, is there any recommendation for any sort of media literature or anything that you would suggest to the audience?
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm coming from the comics perspective, and there's some great work being done right now. I strongly recommend Lumberjanes, which is a a comic book series that has recently finished. HBO Max is making a cartoon out of it. It's all about different relationships to gender, different relationships to sexuality, integrated into a broader universe with really fleshed out characters. It's amazing. Yeah, so if you want sort of a nice thing to kind of check out, step your foot in the water situation, I think Lumberjanes is perfect. It's a great book to read with your kids.
Awesome. And then Kara, get the last word.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I would say, like, shows to watch, maybe we talked about Schitt's Creek. If you're probably living under a rock in Canada if you haven't seen it or heard about it, but that's a great one. I mentioned Sort of. The other one that I was actually just made aware of this morning was a show on CBC. It's particularly for tweens and teens called Heartstopper, which really is centering a gay love story. So has been held up to sort of some high standards around an example of LGBTQ plus representation that is empowering a lot of young people. So I'd recommend Heartstopper as well.
Really great stuff. Kara, Andrew, thank you so much for your insight and your perspective. Thank you for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks.
That is the agenda for Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. As Ontario gets a new cabinet and in particular a new Minister of Health sworn in tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka gets some advice for them on how to deal with a crisis in our hospitals. I am Jan Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and Nam, we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.